Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our very special lecture series tonight. What a turnout. We've had a tremendous response. A lot of people in Canada are really interested in hearing Alan Dershowitz speak. For those who are tuning in for the first time, let me introduce myself. My name is Devorah Shanowitz, and I serve as program director at Chabad Westmount together with my husband, Rabbi Yossi Shanowitz, who serves as director at Chabad Westmount. This lecture is part of the Urban Retail Lecture Series and our new Sunday at 7 Zoom series. And it is part of our law symposium series where we introduce different topics in the legal field, primarily for lawyers, but tonight we are sharing it to the wider public as well. This is the fifth in our series since the beginning of the quarantine, and we invite you to join us every Sunday at 7, where we have fascinating speakers from all walks of life who will share and inspire and inform you. As well, we have Zoom classes. I myself host a Zoom class on Mondays at 11 for women, Torah for women, and Rabbi Yossi also hosts a class on Wednesdays on the Jewish Course of Why, a very popular class. So before we introduce our very esteemed guest tonight, I would like to take a moment to have a few words of inspiration from my dear husband, Rabbi Yossi Shanowitz, who serves as director of Chabad Westmount, and following that we will do the introduction for our very honored guest tonight and the rules on how you can participate in tonight's fascinating and so important discussion. Without further ado, Rabbi Yossi Shanowitz.
Good evening, everyone, and Chodesh Tov. This week we're going to be celebrating the holiday of Shavuos, which begins a Thursday evening and it runs through Shabbat. Shavuos is the day that we received our Constitution, our Torah, and we're going to read the 10 Commandments on the first day of Shavuot, which is on Friday. This year, we're not going to be in the synagogue. Synagogue is going to be closed, but we could read the 10 Commandments at home. Just open up your Chumash book and you could read it, or you can go to the website of Chabad.org and you can find there the 10 Commandments. In anticipation to reading the 10 Commandments, there is an ancient custom that people stay awake the night before and study and review the Constitution. Moreover, there's a day in the year that we take our Constitution and we dance with it, and that's on the day of Simchas Torah. Did you ever hear anybody taking a Constitution and dancing with it? I never heard anyone doing that. And I know on this chat we have legal experts and jurors, and do you ever take the Quebec Constitution and dance with it? I don't think so. But the Torah's Constitution is very different than anyone else's Constitution. The Torah's Constitution is like no other. Every Constitution is created by life. The Torah's Constitution creates life. We say about the Torah, Ki Heim Chayenu, this is our life. The Torah gives us life. The Torah gives us our purpose, gives us our mission, and it's the greatest gift and it's the greatest asset that we have. So this year Shavuos, let's embrace the Torah. It's yours. It belongs to you. It was bequeathed to you. And in the laws of inheritance, there is no difference between a one-day-old child or someone who's 100 years old. No one, when it comes to inheritance, you don't say that you're too young to inherit or that you're too old to inherit. And that's also true with the Torah, that it doesn't matter at what age you are, at what stage you're at. Everyone can start and everyone can begin. And as we say in the Ethics of Our Father, hafachba v'hafachba, we should learn it, we should turn it over, and we should turn it over b'chulaba, because everything is in the Torah. So I want to wish everybody a happy Shavuos. And I just want to tell Professor Dershowitz that at the beginning of this year, I gave a course on the historic and legal rights of Israel. And I found your book, The Case for Israel, to be extremely resourceful. And ever since, I've been recommending your book to so many. So Yasher Koch, and thank you so much for being with us here this evening.
So he's been called America's most public defender, its most bureaucratic civil liberties lawyer. And in fact, he is the best known criminal lawyer in the world. He began his teaching career at Harvard Law School at the age of 25. And in 1967, at the age of 28, he became the youngest full professor of law in Harvard's history. He held the Felix Frankfurter Professorship from 1993 until his retirement in December 2013. He is the author of 40 works of fiction and nonfiction, including 7 bestsellers. More than 1 million of his books have been sold worldwide in numerous languages, and more than 1 million people have heard him lecture around the world. Well, while he's known for defending clients such as Anatoly Natan Sharansky, Klaus von Below, O.J. Simpson, Michael Milken, and Mike Tyson, amongst many others, what is less known about our guest tonight is that he continues to represent numerous indigent defendants and takes half of his cases pro bono. He is a vocal defender of civil liberties and the Constitution. And our very own Erwin Cutler, former Minister of Justice, Montrealer, and a very important member of our community, says about Alan Dershowitz, "I have never met a more principled or honest advocate for truth." So his latest book is Guilt by Accusation, The Challenge of Proving Innocence in the Age of Me Too. And it is a great honor and a pleasure for us to welcome warmly, and please put your hands together for welcoming Professor Alan Dershowitz to Montreal, to the Chabad of Westmount Urim Vitel Lecture Series. Alan Dershowitz.
First of all, the greatest compliment I'm ever paid is when I'm described as the United States' Erwin Cutler. He's sometimes described as Canada's Alan Dershowitz, and Erwin and I have known each other for well over 50 years. Erwin just celebrated his 80th birthday, until 120 at the very least. Erwin and I were born connected. We are brothers in every sense of the word, and I love him. And he's one of the most remarkable human rights activists in the world. Every year I nominate him for the Nobel Peace Prize, and maybe someday it will come. I also want to talk about Chabad for a minute. I'm a great admirer and fan of Chabad. I met the Rabbi several times. First time when I was 13 or 14 years old. He was just became the Rebbe, and he gave me a bechina in Baba Kama. I don't know whether I passed or failed, but it was a great, great honor. And I do half my work now pro bono for Aleph, which is a Chabad organization that helps imprisoned Jews and others around the world. And Shavuos being the holiday of the Torah, I have to start with a story about my Torah. I now own a Torah. How did I get a Torah? A few years ago, I helped a man, a Chabad man named Sholem Rabashnik, who had been excessively sentenced and illegally sentenced and immorally sentenced. I helped him get a commutation from President Trump. I was fortunate to have been with President Trump, and he asked me if I had anything to ask him, and I told him about the Rabashkin case, and that ended up resulting in a commutation. And as a result of that, a prominent philanthropist in New York decided to dedicate a Torah to me. And I had the great zechus, the great honor of putting the last letters in the Torah that the scribe, the Sofer, had beautifully done. And I was able to dedicate various letters to my parents, my grandparents, friends of mine who were ill. And it was a very spiritual moment for me. And guess what's happened to my Torah? My Torah now goes to prison. Chabad comes around periodically and takes my Torah and brings it to prisons in the New York area, other areas, and they read the Torah, my Torah, to prisoners. And so it is a wonderful use of a Torah to help bring religion and Jewish culture to inmates. Tragically, there are many Jewish inmates in American prisons. I suspect there are more than one or two in Canadian prisons, and they have the right to have their religion taught to them in prison. And so this week we're going to honor the Aseret HaDibrot. I don't call it the Ten Commandments because the first statement is not a commandment. Anochi Hashem, I'm the Lord your God. It's a statement. And the literal translation of Aseret HaDibrot are the 10 statements. They contain many commandments, and these commandments are the source of so much law and justice. At Harvard Law School, I taught a course for several years called The Scriptural Sources of Justice, in which I looked at the sources in the Torah and the Talmud and various other religious and scriptural sources and the impact they've had on Western law, on law in general. And as a result of that seminar, I wrote a book called The Genesis of Justice, where I explored in great detail Bereshit, the book of Bereshit, which develops kind of the common law. Shemot, which is the 10 Commandments, which we will celebrate, is the statutory law, the Constitution, as the rabbi put it, the written Constitution. It lays out the rules in detail. In Bereshit, what we see is a group of people struggling to do justice without written law. And each of the 10 Commandments, in fact, is based on an episode in the book of Bereshit. You might ask yourself, why do we elevate the commandment, do not bear false witness against your friend? And of course, that grows out of Joseph's encounter where he was falsely accused by Potiphar's wife. All the other commandments you can trace to struggles for justice in the first book of the Torah, Bereshit. And so we have much, much to celebrate. We are called the people of the book. We created the book, and that book has had an enormous influence on civilizations throughout the world. It's interesting that Israel is the nation of the book. No country, in modern times certainly, but I'm not sure of any country in history, has ever had a more legitimate legal origin than the nation state of the Jewish people in Israel. Israel had to fight with the sword for its survival, but it was established by law, by the Balfour Declaration, by the League of Nations, by the United Nations in 1947, and then in 1948, by Israel's Declaration of Independence, all legal documents. Not surprising, because so many of Israel's founders had been legally trained. They weren't practicing lawyers, but they had gone to law school. Ben Gurion went to law school. Begin went to law school. Many of the other founders of Zionism, Herzl studied law. So when Israel was established, it was established by law, unlike the United States, which was established by revolution, or Canada, which took over lands of Aboriginal Native people, not Israel. Israel established settlements, areas that it bought legitimately in the same way that Abraham bought from Ephron. The cave to bury his wife. Israel was established by the Jewish National Fund, by the Rothschilds, by purchasing land, and then that land became the basis for the tiny little sliver of a state that the Peel Commission offered Israel in 1938, and Israel accepted and the Palestinians rejected, and the slightly larger but still small amount of land allocated by the United Nations for a Jewish state in 1948, which the Arab nations rejected and invaded Israel, and Israel then captured more land, and then again more land. We also celebrate this past week Yom Yerushalayim, the liberation of Jerusalem from under the illegal occupation by Jordan, and Israel's legitimate claims to the Kotel, the Jewish Quarter, the access roads to Hebrew University, Hadassah Hospital, which last year, 2 years ago, I'm sorry, it's now more than that. It's now 3.5 years ago. The United Nations Security Council tried to reject, calling Israel's control of the Kotel and the Hebrew University access roads and the Jewish Quarter flagrant violations of international law. Total nonsense. Barack Obama was to blame for that. He engineered that. I voted for him twice, but I broke my relationship, my personal relationship with him, which went back to his days as a law school student, when I saw that he engineered that revenge against Netanyahu by allowing the United Nations Security Council, to its everlasting disgrace, to declare that the Kotel was flagrantly illegally occupied territory. That would be like saying the Vatican was flagrantly illegally occupied by the Catholic Church, or Salt Lake City by the Mormons, or Mecca and Medina by Muslims. Obviously, Israel, the nation state of the Jewish people, has complete legitimate claims to the Kotel, the Hebrew University, to Hadassah Hospital, to the Jewish Quarter, and to the unification of Jerusalem. I'll never forget a conversation that I had with President Trump. He asked me my opinion before he recognized Jerusalem and moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And I said to Mr. President, if you had asked me this question 5 years ago, I might have said, well, maybe you should wait until there is a peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But once the Security Council of the United Nations delegitimated and changed the status quo and took the Kotel as a matter of international law away from Israel, you must act to reverse that. And you can't reverse a UN Security Council resolution because the Chinese and the Russians have a veto. So the only way to do it is by now, immediately, today, declaring Jerusalem to be the eternal capital of the state of Israel, moving the embassy there forever and ever. And even the Democratic candidate for president now said he would not reverse that decision. Israel will retain as its eternal, undivided capital the city of Jerusalem, which it is entitled to as a matter of international law, as a matter of Israeli law, as a matter of Jewish law, as a matter of treaties. So nobody should be in any way embarrassed to proclaim Yom Yerushalayim as a celebratory day in which Israel can celebrate its defensive war against Jordan. People forget that Jordan attacked Israel. Jordan sent rockets into civilian areas of Jerusalem. It declared war on Israel. Israel hadn't attacked Jordan. It had attacked Egypt and Syria in a preventive, preemptive war, but not Jordan. It sent emissaries to Jordan saying, if you stay out of this war, we won't even try to capture the Kotel. But Jordan came into the war. Israel captured the Kotel in the West Bank, all legitimately as part of a defensive war. So Israel continues to operate under the rule of law, which is why it's so remarkable and outrageous that the International Criminal Court, which I supported when it was first established. I know Irwin supported it. He was a big admirer and supporter of the International Criminal Court as a way of bringing the rule of law to rogue nations, many of which are in Africa and other parts of the world. And the first chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court understood his role, Luis Ocampo from Argentina. But then when he was replaced by a radical political prosecutor, she has now insisted that Palestine is a state. It doesn't have any borders, it doesn't have elections, it doesn't have any of the manifestations of a state. And that although Israel is not a signatory to the Rome Treaty and not part of the International Criminal Court, they have jurisdiction over Israel. And moreover, Israel has the best legal system of any country in the Middle East, and no country in history faced with threats comparable to those faced by Israel has ever had a better record of human rights, civil liberties, a better record of the rule of law, a better record of concern for the lives of enemy civilians than Israel. And yet Israel is being now subjected to an investigation. We will fight that. I have offered the Prime Minister of Israel, whoever he is, that I will pro bono help represent Israel in front of the International Criminal Court. I hope Erwin will join me and others, and we will put together a great legal team to defend Israel and to point the accusatory finger at those who deserve to be accused and not at the nation state of the Jewish people, which has the best record of human rights and civil liberties. So these are trying times. Not only do we have a pandemic, but the Palestinian Authority has now said that they will stop abiding by the Oslo Accords, may end security relations with Israel. The Prime Minister of Israel, for the first time in history, is now standing trial while he is the Prime Minister for accusations that do not, in my view, constitute a crime. No country in history has ever accused a leader of a crime for seeking good media coverage or trying to reduce bad media coverage. Every political figure seeks good media coverage and tries to avoid negative media coverage. It would establish a terrible, terrible precedent were Benjamin Netanyahu convicted of these crimes. Even as to the first crime, accepting champagne and cigars and whatever else, if the Knesset wants to pass a law prohibiting that, they can do that, but there is no such law. The Knesset should pass a law saying anybody in public life who accepts more than, say, 10,000 shekels worth of gifts, make that a crime, but let the Knesset pass it. Let the Knesset pass a law that says if you seek good coverage in the media, you've committed a crime. The Knesset wouldn't have a single vote for that because every member of the Knesset would be prosecuted if seeking good media coverage or seeking to reduce bad media coverage were to be deemed to be a crime. So I hope that the Israeli legal system will apply the rule of law to its very controversial prime minister, a prime minister who I've known personally since the early 1970s. We met when he was a student at the MIT School of Business when I was teaching at Harvard Law School, and we've remained close personal friends for nearly half a century. And I think it would be a terrible injustice for him to be convicted of crimes that are just essentially made up from broad prohibitions that don't specify the conduct that the prime minister is being accused of. So we live in difficult and dangerous times. You know, the Psalms have a very interesting statement. It says, Hashem oz le'amo yitain. God will give the Jewish people oz, strength. Hashem yivarech et amo b'shalom. And I interpret that as meaning the Jewish people and the state of Israel will only survive if oz comes before shalom. We're never going to get shalom without oz. We need power. We need strength. We need to be stronger than all of our enemies combined. We live at a time with increasing anti-Semitism, both from the extreme right and the extreme left. And Jews should never be embarrassed about flexing their muscles and using their power, their economic power. They earned it the hard way. Look at the Jewish contributions to Canada. Jews are a small percentage of the Canadian population. They have contributed disproportionately to the success of Canada in much the way that American Jews have contributed disproportionately to the success of the country I love. Canadian Jews are loyal citizens who love Canada, just the way we in the United States love our country. But we have the obligation to speak out as first-class citizens, never to remain silent in the face of bigotry, anti-Semitism, the BDS movement, anti-Israel, anti-Zionism. We must speak out. We must use our oaths. We must use our strength, our economic strength, our academic strength, our moral strength, our every aspect of our strength. Israel must use its military strength. It must be qualitatively superior to all of its enemies combined. It must have better cybersecurity. It must have better nuclear security. It must have better land and sea and air security. And for too many years, the Jewish people have relied on their moral sense. We relied on our moral sense. There's a great exchange of letters between Judah Magnus, the founder of Hebrew University, and Mahatma Gandhi, one of the most overrated moralists in the world. Magnus and others asked Mahatma Gandhi to stand up for the Jewish people during the Holocaust. And Gandhi, who was a fervent racist, he hated Black people when he lived in South Africa. He was a major racist against the Black people. He called himself an Aryan. Mahatma Gandhi refused to help the Jewish people. He said, look, the Jews have morality on their side. They don't need physical strength. They should just lay down in front of the German tanks and be killed. And maybe the German tanks will stop if the Jews lay down in front of them the way Indians lay down in front of British. And Magnus basically said, are you a fool, Gandhi? Don't you understand the difference between the British, they're immoral people, and the Nazis? They'll just roll over the Jews. We learned the lesson in the Shoah, that morality is not enough. As Elie Wiesel, who was my teacher, my rabbi, my sage, put it so well, he said the lesson of the Shoah is always believe the threats of your enemies more than the promises of your friends. And so the Jewish people have to become self-reliant. Israel has to become self-reliant. Israel has to prepare for the unlikely eventuality, unlikely but possible, that the world will abandon it the way the world abandoned the Jewish people during the Shoah. It must have the ability to defend itself without anyone's help. The Jewish people of the United States and Canada, although we're loyal and patriotic and we love our countries, we have to be prepared to defend ourselves against all manner of anti-Semitism without regard to whether others will help us. And so on this very important day between Yom Yerushalayim and Shavuot, I'll end with a joke. This is a true story, by the way, about Shavuot. So I was lighting the Hanukkah candles in Miami. I hope nobody thinks it's a little rude, my story. I hope not. I don't think so. So I was lighting the Hanukkah candles on Lincoln Road in Miami, and a rabbi from North Carolina came to me and said, this is a true story. Somebody came to me the other day, one of my congregants, with a deep Southern accent. And she said, you know, Rabbi, we used to say good Shabbos. Now we have to say Shabbat. We used to say Sukkot. Now we have to say Sukkot. We used to say Shavuos. Now we have to say Shavuot. Can we still say Tuchis? And the rabbi said, yes, that you have the right to say. So without any of us trying to sit on our Tuchis, because that's not what Jews do, we stand up and we fight for our rights. Let me wish you all a happy Shavuos, a happy Shavuot, Zaman Matan Toratenu. So let's rejoice, and let me take your questions. Ask me the hardest questions you want. I promise I'll try to answer.
Okay, so what we're going to do, just to prevent any kind of Zoom bombing, I'm going to ask you, please, all our participants, we have a wonderful, really huge crowd. The reservations are still coming in. Everyone is trying to join. Please text 514-591-6744. So I'm going to repeat that number. If you want to grab a pen or paper, it's 514-591-6744. Text your questions there, and we will relay it to Professor Dershowitz. Okay.
You know, my grandmother would probably say today, if she were alive, she's probably would say today, I'm ausgezoomt. I'm ausgezoomt. There's so much Zooming. Well, I'm not ausgezoomt. I love Zooming. It gives us an opportunity to really connect and interact. I think Zoom is going to be part of our future. You've already taken advantage of it. You have these marvelous classes on Zoom that occur all the time. So I can tell you I'm not ausgezoomt.
So Professor Dershowitz, I just want to tell you that our Montrealers are not ausgezoomt either. When people heard that you were going to be here, the reaction was overwhelming. Everyone wanted to hear, everyone wants to hear you. Everyone wants to hear what you have to say. They certainly have a lot of questions. You've been a source of great wisdom and also courage on behalf of the Jewish voice, if I could say. I know that you once said about yourself that you were the most Jewish Jew at Harvard, and that's quite a feat. And for myself, my husband Yossi is from Brooklyn. And I think
Really?
there's some,
What neighborhood? What part of Brooklyn are you from?
Wells. Crown Heights.
Williamsburg, Crown
Crown
Heights.
Heights.
I was born in Williamsburg,
Okay.
and I moved to Borough Park when I was like 4 years old. And then I went to yeshiva in Crown Heights, not far from the Chabad headquarters.
Oh, wow.
And my best friend, my classmate, was Tzvi Groner. And Tzvi's
Oh.
uncle, Rabbi Groner, was the Rebbe's assistant, the
Oh,
Rebbe's
wow.
secretary, the Rebbe's shamus, however you want to call him. So the first time I met the Rebbe was Tzvi took me to lunch with his uncle, and this man with this very distinguished beard and dark, beautiful eyes came out and introduced himself. I didn't know who he was, and asked me what Gemara I was learning. And I told him, and then he asked me a few questions, and I don't know whether I passed or failed.
so I think there's something to be said for Brooklyn boys and having chutzpah. I think that, us Canadians, I grew up in Montreal, I'm born in Montreal, that we're more reticent, we're more small C conservative, and more polite. We like to do the right thing, maybe because of all the loyalist tradition in Canada. But we have this kind of attitude. Nevertheless, we're always focused on what's happening south of the border. I mean, Montreal is just 100 kilometers or less from the U.S. border, and all major Canadian cities are really close. And I guess you are our big brothers up or down there. And so I just wanted to ask you: is there something about growing up in the U.S. do you think that helped create who you are? Before we get to the tough questions.
Sure.
I remember reading that the Rebbe said when he became Rebbe, and he said there was something unique about American youth that he did not find in any other societies, that they, as much as they were rebellious and therefore very unmalleable because they would do their own thing, that they could be really inspired to greatness in a way that others could not. And I want to know if you could talk to that experience, to that Brooklyn.
Sure. Well, I have to admit, I was a terrible yeshiva student. I was not a good yeshiva student. I used to get suspended all the time because I would always ask the hard questions. The rabbis would sometimes call them klutz kashers. And one day, Rabbi Zuraf, who was the principal of our school, who's Ephraim Zuraf's late father, called me in my last year of school and says, Dershowitz, you got a good mouth on you, but a Yiddish cup you don't have. You're not a good student. He said, you should think of doing something where you have to use your mouth a lot, but not your brain. He said, I have two ideas. One, you could be a lawyer. Or two, he said, you could be a conservative rabbi. Because, of course, that would be the greatest insult. He couldn't even pronounce the word reform. Of course, I wasn't smart enough to be a rabbi, so I became a lawyer. And but I was not a good student. I was a good basketball player, and I had a good sense of humor. And but a good student, I was not. I graduated high school with about a 70-something average out of 100, and I couldn't get into college. I had to take a special test to get into Brooklyn College because you needed an 82 average to be able to get in automatically, and I didn't have the 82 average. And then I finished first in my class in Brooklyn College and first in my class in Yale Law School. So obviously I was a late bloomer.
One more question from me before we get to the questions from the crowd and the audience who are sending in their texts furiously. Your experience in college campus has been extensive. You started off as a professor really at the young age of 25, and you've had a really long tenure at Harvard. And I think you were the youngest full professor that Harvard ever had. And you've seen the change, I guess, on college campuses in terms of the BDS movement that's arisen lately and all the other issues that young Jewish students have to face. In our Chabad, we do a lot of outreach with young people and with young students. And from your position in your experience and your position at Harvard and your influence in campus life, what advice would you give to young people today, or to educators such as ourselves who are
we have to fight back.
The young people? What and how do we impact the young people to find their voice as Jewish people?
We have to fight back, obviously. I'll give you an example in Montreal. So a few years ago, Concordia didn't allow Ehud Barak to speak, if I'm not mistaken. They canceled his speech. I wrote a letter to the president of Concordia saying, I will never speak at Concordia unless you can allow people like Ehud Barak to speak. I'm not going to come to speak on a campus where you have a double standard. And I'm told now that Concordia has really turned it around and is much better. I can't speak to that. I'm not there, but I'm told that. And McGill University has had its problems, much, much worse, by the way, in some of the Toronto schools. When I spoke at Toronto Law School a few years ago, I needed armed guards that stood on the stage with me armed because there were threats to my life, because I was speaking about Israel. And, you know, I'm a moderate on Israel. I believe in the two-state solution. I was not thrilled about some of Israel's settlement policies. I'm way to the left of where many people in the Jewish community are on Israel, but I'm a Zionist, a staunch Zionist. I love Israel. And so they try to silence me on college campuses at Toronto, at Berkeley, at Johns Hopkins University, at Columbia. Events have been canceled. We have to fight back. At Berkeley, I threatened a lawsuit in order to get myself to speak, and they backed down, and I was able to speak. And what I do when I speak at a place like Berkeley or Toronto is I welcome the protesters to come and listen. I say, you will get the first questions. I will not turn to any positive questions until I answer all the negative questions, but you can't try to shut me down. That is, you can't shout me down. You have to listen to my answers, and you can say whatever you want. And I think that works fairly effectively. But A, you have to go to the administration and make sure they take responsibility. It's illegal to discriminate against Jews, illegal to discriminate against Israelis. And so we have to use the law, we have to use economic pressure, moral pressure, but the key is always to fight back.
So we have a question here. Someone
Sure.
is asking if you feel that the lockdown, the way it's been practiced and implemented, contravenes in any fashion the US Constitution as you understand it.
Well, let's start with Canada. The first time I ever had any real experiences in Canadian law was when the first Prime Minister Trudeau invited me to come and meet with him and meet with John Turner, who was then the Attorney General, Minister of Justice of Canada, and Irwin Cotler, who was working for him, because you'll remember in 1970, Canada declared the War Measures Act, and it basically closed down parts of the country because of a couple of acts of terrorism, not a pandemic like this. And so that was my first experience with emergency laws. And I wrote a series of articles back in the 1970s based on the Canadian experience. And I'm just publishing a new book now called The Case for Liberalism in an Age of Extremism, or Why I Left the Left but Couldn't Join the Right, in which I have a chapter on the Canadian experience, the American experience. We don't do well in emergencies. In emergencies, the first casualty is often the rule of law. For example, in the United States and in Canada, I'm sure it's true too, it's not clear what powers the executive has as distinguished from the legislature. Does a mayor have a right to close the city down? Does a governor have a right, or must it come from the legislature? What powers are given to the executive authorities during emergencies? These are very complicated issues. You'll notice that President Trump recently, just yesterday, the day before, said he wants synagogues, churches, and mosques to reopen. The Jewish community has to make its own decisions about reopening. Shavuos, obviously, we're going to stay home, but what about Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? It's coming up fairly quickly. We're going to have to make decisions. I don't want to miss Chazan Helfgot singing Kol Nidre. I look forward to it every year. I go to an modern Orthodox synagogue in New York, and Chazan Helfgot, I'm a groupie. I follow him around wherever he goes, and Rabbi Schneier. I love my shul. I want to go to my shul. I don't want to have to miss my shul. What they're doing now in some churches, shuls obviously can't do it on Shabbat, is they're having drive-in services, like drive-in movies, where you stay in your car. We have to adapt. Orthodox Jews will have a harder time because you can't Zoom on Shabbat or on the holidays, and you can't drive. So we'll have to adapt. And we're very good at adapting. I'll give you a Trivial Pursuit question. I'll give you the question now, and then maybe some people can think about it and answer. What is the most important halachic decision ever made by a Jewish rabbi? And I'll give you a hint. If that halachic decision hadn't been made, none of us would be here. You wouldn't be in Canada. I wouldn't be in the United States. My grandparents wouldn't have come to the United States. Your grandparents wouldn't have come to Brooklyn. What was the single most important halachic decision ever rendered? And it was a dramatic decision when it was rendered. Anybody want to guess? I'll give you a chance to guess, and then I'll tell you the story. I'll tell you the answer. And I didn't get it from any book. I just made it up, and maybe I'm wrong. Any guesses? Any guesses? You want me to tell you? All right, I'll tell you. The decision that said you can ride on a boat on Shabbat. Because it used to be the rule that just like you couldn't ride on a horse on Shabbat, you couldn't ride on a wagon, you couldn't ride on a boat because you're traveling. And the rule was changed. And you were allowed to go on a boat as long as you were passive and you weren't the captain and you just sat there and you didn't get on the boat or get off the boat. Remember, it took a long time to get from Europe to America. There were no airplanes. So if not for that rule, none of our grandparents, all of whom were Orthodox, could have come to America. They weren't going to go from London to to Iceland, to Greenland, to Canada. They had to cross. And that became, I think, the single most important halakhic decision. And it shows the adaptability of halakha. And, that it's not a single road. It's a single road, but it has many pathways.
So we have a question here from a student who is an aspiring law student.
Great.
And he wants to know if you can give him or any other law students advice on two elements. One, which we addressed slightly before, which is the issue of Jewish identity on campus, but also as a law student, what path or what advice would you give him as someone who has been through it all? Okay,
well, first of all, of course, I wrote a book about it. I wrote a book called Letters to a Young Lawyer. You can get it on Kindle. It's like a couple of dollars. And all the advice I give in that book. So you can get the advice from that book. But I think the most important advice is make sure you pick an area of law where you get up every single morning and say to yourself, I can't wait until I get to work. Do not ever have a job where you say, thank God it's Friday. You can say, thank God it's Shabbat. Okay, that's different. But you don't want a job where you're just waiting for the job to end. For me, the great job is on Sunday. I'm already having shpilkus. I want to get to work on Monday. I don't know what exciting thing's going to happen, but I know something exciting is going to happen in my life. So I think you really have to look to something that's very exciting, something that gives you pleasure more than the money. Obviously, the money is important. You have to send your kids to good schools and all of that. But having an exciting job where you wake up every morning and say, I can't wait to get to work. I've had the pleasure of being able to experience that. In terms of being a Jewish lawyer, what could be better? I am a Jewish lawyer. My Jewish students always came to the class with an advantage, particularly the ones who studied Talmud. Rambam was wrong. He was a great man, but Rambam was anti-Talmud. He said, look, it's the Mishnah Torah. There's one right way of looking at it, and he knows the right way. That's not the Jewish way. The Jewish way is to argue, to fight, to disagree, to come up with arguments, to reject the arguments. That's why Jews are great tax lawyers too. First, they have the tax law, then they have the exceptions to the tax law, then they have the exceptions to the exceptions. It's the way halakha operates. It is a living process, and the law is a living process. And I think if you've studied Talmud, if you've studied Mishnah, if you've studied Pilpul, you will have a tremendous advantage in your legal career and your legal background. By the way, it's not only Jews, but Jesuits as well. Catholic students who went to good Jesuit schools, when I had them as my students, they were terrific. They would make great arguments, and it was always fun to see the students from the Jesuit schools argue with the students from the Talmudic schools. And but knowing how to argue, knowing how to frame arguments is very important for a lawyer.
So indeed, I know that you called Avram Avinu, Abraham, our father, the first Jewish lawyer, and that you model yourself in his ways and the way that he advocated on behalf of Sodom and to try to find merit. So here we have a question that's a little bit different. It's more political. Someone's asking, how high up do you think the Durham report and the Senate investigations will reach, and if there's going to be any serious accounting or any outcome or fallout as a result?
It's interesting. It's a very hard question. The U.S. Attorney Durham in Connecticut has a very good reputation. I don't think he's going to find crimes committed by anybody in the Obama administration. You never know, but I don't think so. And I wouldn't be in favor of that. I don't want to see the criminal justice system weaponized for political purposes. I didn't want to see it weaponized against Hillary Clinton. I was very opposed when General Flynn made his speech and said, lock her up, lock her up. And then I was very opposed when they prosecuted General Flynn. I'm neutral politically. I voted for Hillary Clinton. I'm a liberal Democrat. I've always voted for liberal Democrats. But when it comes to the law, I'm totally neutral, which is why I was prepared to accept President Trump's request of me that I make the case against impeachment in front of the United States Senate. I didn't vote for President Trump. I disagree with many of his policies on immigration, on healthcare, on taxes, on the environment. I disagree with some of the ways he's been handling the pandemic. I agree with others. I think that having warp speed, trying to move toward vaccine and cures was very, very good. But I didn't make the decision for political reasons. I made the decision for the same reason that I'm now supporting Prime Minister Netanyahu. I don't think you should make up crimes if you don't like people. I don't think we should use the criminal justice system as a substitute for elections. I don't think we should use impeachment as a substitute for elections. You know, the United States has a very different system from Canada. In Canada, if you don't like Prime Minister Trudeau, you have a vote of the parliament. If he doesn't get the majority, he's out. It doesn't matter how many elections he wins. You don't need impeachment. All you need is a vote of no confidence by the legislature. That's true in Israel, that's true in England, that's true in most European countries. The United States is different. We elect presidents for 4 years, and they're supposed to stay for 4 years unless they commit treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And by the way, the argument I made in front of the Senate was a pure Talmudic argument. What I said is, look at the words of the Constitution: treason, bribery, other high crimes and misdemeanors. Let's start with the pshat. What's the pshat? What is the literal meaning? It means a crime. All right, you want to go from the pshat to the drash? Okay, let's go to that. But the only way you can find that there's a basis for impeachment is if you go to sod or remez. And those are not constitutionally appropriate methods for interpretation. We have no secret interpretations in the constitutional, and remez is also not something that I think we want to base our laws on. So it's interesting, after I made my speech, I got a lot of calls from rabbis saying, aha, we saw what you were doing. We knew that you were using your Talmudic background to make the arguments. And of course, I am who I am. I am a product of my upbringing. I think that way. And I think it helped me a lot in my talk in front of the United States Senate.
Wow.
So we have actually someone who, we have two opposing texts. One is saying, how can you be a lifelong Democrat and quote unquote support President Trump? And they don't understand how you can support someone like him. And then another text which says, thank you for helping President Trump out in the impeachment. So we have back to back two opposing texts wanting to know, how could you do it? And one saying, how could you not do it?
Well, neither of them understands me. It's not a hard question. I would do it no matter who the president was. I worked for President Clinton when he was impeached. The only other time I appeared in front of the United States Senate was on behalf of a Democrat, Alan Cranston, and I argued for him. I don't take my cases based on politics. I take them based on the law and the Constitution. I wrote a book about my defense of President Trump. It doesn't mention President Trump. The name of the book is Defending the Constitution. You can read my speech in the Senate. It's in the book. I never mentioned President Trump in my speech. I was not there defending him. I was there defending the Constitution. I think that the Democrats misuse the Constitution in a political way, and I made that argument. And so, of course, I would defend him. If Hillary Clinton had been elected president and they tried to impeach her on the same ground, I would have made the same argument. Want to hear something interesting? I wrote a book and published it called The Case Against Impeaching Trump. You know what the original title of the book was? The Case Against Impeaching Hillary Clinton. I started writing it in the summer of 2016 when everybody thought Hillary Clinton would be the president. The Republicans were threatening to impeach her. I started doing my research then to try to come up with arguments against the impeachment of Hillary Clinton. Then, of course, the election didn't turn out that way. And so I just changed the title of my book. If I had written the book, The Case Against Impeaching Hillary Clinton, they'd have built a statue to me on Martha's Vineyard. But today, when I go to Martha's Vineyard, nobody speaks to me. It's very easy for me to engage in social distancing on Martha's Vineyard. Nobody wants to be near me because I defended President Trump's rights not to be impeached. But I'm not political, and when it comes to my legal career.
So on the same vein, someone's asking, again, a political question, how do you still support the Democratic Party as a lifelong Democrat, given the fact that there have been certain elements in the Democratic Party that have come out to be anti-Israel? And I would like to reframe that in a more positive vein. What do you think the Democrats have to do to shore themselves up against the creeping anti-Semitism in certain aspects that are certain elements of their party?
Look, it's not only a question for America, it's a question for Canada and for Great Britain. It's most extreme in Great Britain. Jews used to be supporters of the Labour Party. The Labour Party became overtly anti-Semitic with Corbyn, and the Jews left in large numbers. Canada, not nearly as bad, obviously, but the former conservative prime minister of Canada was somewhat more pro-Israel, Harper, than the current prime minister. But many Jews still support the left in Canada. I want to see support for Israel remain bipartisan. So I'm a Democrat. And I work very hard to make sure people like Biden get nominated and not people like Sanders. I mean, the great Shanda is that the first Jew to become a serious presidential candidate was probably the most anti-Israel person ever to run for president of the United States. And I was thrilled that he was defeated. I could not have voted for Sanders. I would not have voted for Sanders if he got the nomination. It would have been the first time in my life I couldn't pull the lever for a Democrat, ironically, the first Jew. Obviously, I was thrilled when Joe Lieberman became the vice presidential nominee because Joe is a great Zionist, a great supporter of Israel, a great Jew. His book on Shabbat is one of the great books everybody should read. And Joe was a good friend of mine, but Sanders, I could never have voted for. And but I think Biden, who I've known since the 1970s, is a friend of Israel. He is a critic of some of Israel's policies, but I think he's a friend. I think the Republican Party is more pro-Israel than the Democratic Party, but I want to keep the Democratic Party pro-Israel. I want to marginalize the squad. I want to make sure that at least two of the newly elected Democrats who have expressed fairly strong anti-Israel and anti-Semitic views are marginalized within the Democratic Party. If I quit and became a Republican, I wouldn't have any influence within the Democratic Party. So I'm going to remain a Democrat as long as I have some influence within the Democratic Party. When they were thinking of nominating as head of the Democratic Party a man who had a long history of anti-Semitism and association with Farrakhan, I threatened to leave the Democratic Party. And he was not named as the head of the party, so I remain. So it's a work in progress, but I hope to remain a Democrat. I understand why many Jews will want to vote for President Trump. He did recognize Jerusalem, move the embassy. He did recognize Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights. He did rip up the Iran deal. His Secretary of State has said that there'll be consequences if the International Criminal Court were to try to prosecute any Israelis. The Trump administration has been very strong and very positive. I think the peace plan that they've proposed is a terrific plan. I wish people would read it and not prejudge it. Some people say, if Trump did it, it must be bad. No, it's a very, very good plan. I give it my hashgacha. I worked on it myself. I went to the White House for several days and worked with the people who were working on that plan. I've discussed it extensively with Jared Kushner, with David Friedman, with the president. I had dinner with the president in the residence of the White House when we were working on the plan, and he wanted my opinion on the plan. And I told him what I agreed with and a few things I disagreed with. Some of the things were changed. But I will help any president who is elected, even if Sanders, God forbid, had been elected and asked my help on Israel. Of course I would offer my help on Israel, just like I offer my help to any prime minister of Israel. I advised Yitzhak Rabin, I advised Sharon, I advised Begin, I advised Olmert, and I am advising Netanyahu. I'm proud to do that. We'll continue to do that with every Israeli prime minister, with every American president. And if any Canadian prime minister wants my advice, I'm there for them.
So I just want to clarify, the questions are coming in fast and furious. What I have done is amalgamated some of your questions. So some of you are asking me why the question was not posed the way it was written. It was just to try to include as many viewpoints in the questions as possible. So I apologize for that, but I ask for your understanding.
You're terrific. Hey, you are terrific. Nobody should. Your questions are great. You're doing a terrific job.
Thank you.
Even though you don't come from Brooklyn, you're really smart.
But my mother comes from Brooklyn, so I'm.
That explains it.
That explains it all. And I love Brooklyn, so you know it's second home for us. So a question that I have about, you know, you've been involved in so many different cases, as was mentioned previously. What was your toughest case?
Without a doubt, Sharansky. Natan Sharansky. When Natan Sharansky's, you know, I never met him when I represented him. I didn't meet him. Irwin didn't meet him. What happened is his mother and his wife called Irwin and me and asked us if we would become his lawyers. And we did it on a pro bono basis. We went to Russia, the Soviet Union in those days. And we knew that we couldn't win the case purely on legal grounds. Irwin wrote a brief that was unbelievable. I still have it. It's about 500 pages long. You know, when Irwin writes a brief or makes a speech, you always know he starts by saying, there are 16 reasons, or there are 32 reasons. This one had about 300 reasons. And he went down one point by point, just devastating the prosecution's case. But in the end, we knew we couldn't win just based on the law. We needed economic pressure. We needed diplomatic pressure. We had the support of the United States administration. And it's interesting because one day after Natan was released, and by the way, people ask me sometimes what the biggest legal fee I ever earned was. And I say, when Natan Sharansky walked over the Gleineke Bridge and he threw his arms around me when I met him for the first time, and he whispered in my ear, Baruch Matir Asurim. That was the greatest legal fee I will ever earn in my life. It's more important than any dollars. And a few years later, I got a handwritten note from President George W. Bush. He wrote to me and said, I just want to thank you for getting my friend Natan Sharansky out of prison. Sharansky has had an enormous impact on my life. I've read his book, The Case for Democracy. And so President Bush was a tremendous admirer of Natan Sharansky, but that was the toughest case.
Another question, someone is asking if they're trying to work on helping people return gold stolen from the Holocaust, and would you be interested in helping them?
I have to tell you, I have made I've made a policy of never taking cases involving finances or money or property based on the Holocaust. I completely support, I admire people who try to get it back, but for me, the Holocaust has always transcended the physical, transcended the financial. And so I just want to devote my time in trying to prevent future genocides rather than to try to get the money back. But I can recommend very good lawyers who do that kind of work, but it's not the kind of work that I do.
Okay, so for the person who asked the question, if you want, you can, I guess you can get in touch with Alan to see the lawyers that he would recommend for you. Going forward, what is your biggest concern for the American Jewish community, the Canadian Jewish community, I guess Western Jewry as a whole? What is your concern going forward, whether it is from an existential issue or whether it is from a constitutional or legal issue? What is your concern for those communities?
Look, to be a Jew means you can never heave a sigh of relief and say, we're safe, it's over. We still have to look over our right shoulder, our left shoulder. We have so many people who are against us, and then we are our own enemies. You look at America. Today, every major political leader in America has a Jewish son-in-law, daughter-in-law, grandchild. You cannot name a major leader in America today. Obviously, President Trump. Obviously, President Clinton. I guess Obama is an exception. Biden has a Jewish son-in-law. Cuomo. They all, I mean, the Jewish intermarriage has become so rampant that it has created both negatives and positives. We're going to see in our future millions of people, Americans, who are, quote, of Jewish heritage, the way we have people of Irish heritage or Italian heritage. They may have only one grandparent who's Irish or one grandparent who's Italian, but they claim a heritage. We're going to have that in our future, but it will also mean fewer actual Jews. And we have to learn how to deal with that, because we can try to reverse the trends. But, you know, as I used to say when I spoke to Jewish audiences, do you want to make sure your son or daughter marries a Jew? It's very simple, very simple. Either move to Israel or move to Borough Park or Muncie and become a chassid. If you move to Israel, your child will marry a Jew. If you become a chassid, your child will marry somebody who's Jewish. But if you send your son or daughter to Princeton and Yale and Columbia and Harvard and Stanford, which Jewish families want to do because they now have access to the best universities in the world, it's inevitable that some will meet wonderful, wonderful people who they will fall in love with, and they will be of a different faith. And that's just a reality. We can do everything in our power to try to reverse it. We should make sure that Jewishness and Judaism is so central to their life that it's inconceivable if they want to share their life with anybody who is not Jewish. But it's still going to result in, as I say today in America, everybody wants to marry a Jew, except apparently other Jews. Everybody is marrying us. You know, today we're not being hurt by hatred, we're being hurt by love. People love us. We make good spouses. We're good providers. People want to marry Jews, except Jews don't want to marry Jews. So that's been the real problem, and I think we have to deal with that realistically. I was on a television Zoom this morning with Australia, and there was a rabbi there from Australia who's trying very hard to make conversion to Judaism a little bit easier, so that when you get into marriage, the non-Jewish spouse can find it easier. It shouldn't be as daunting as it is today. You know, when I was growing up, the Jewish attitude was, we don't want you. We're not a conversion religion. We don't want you. Stay away. Pick another. That's not the attitude today. The attitude today is, we want you, but boy, you're going to have to work so hard to join our club that you may choose not to. I'm not saying we ought to water it down, but I'm saying we have to figure out a way of making it more attractive and easier for people who genuinely want to become Jewish to become Jewish.
So Alan, so today, this morning, I was privy to a very beautiful Hebrew school Zoom graduation at our Chabad. And I think that's exactly what we've been dedicating ourselves to here under the great leadership of Rabbi Ariel and Mushki. They did a wonderful Zoom graduation, even though the Hebrew school was truncated as a result of COVID. And precisely this engaged, innovative learning is where we focus and what we're doing and what we're at. And I think that really plays into the mission of Chabad, where we're trying to really engage students, young people, the next generation, to have a vibrant Jewish experience. You know, often in the past, in the previous generations, I guess because of persecution and difficulty, there was a real, if I could use a Yiddish expression, a krachzing. There was the oi. There was a lot of whining almost.
We need joy instead of oi, right?
Exactly. And so there was a lot of oi, and this was hard. And Judaism was a burden. And today, that message is not going to fly. We need to make Judaism engaged. It has to be engaged emotionally, intellectually, spiritually, and using all the senses. And that's what we're trying to do. We try to be innovative. We have such a beautiful heritage. And when we lose children who do not connect for the next generation, we've lost worlds. And so we're doing everything we can, and that's our mission. Yeah.
I agree. And I want to end with a story of how my experience with that. So it's now about 20 years ago, and a very young man with a very young, very handsome young man with a very young, beautiful wife knocked on my door at Harvard and said, "Hi, my name is Hershey Zarki, and this is my wife, and we want to start a Chabad at Harvard. There's no university in the world that has a Chabad." And everybody's laughing at us. Everybody's saying, Chabad at Harvard? Harvard is this intellectual center of learning, and Chabad is, you know, joyous and emotional and neshama. And I said, I'm on your side. I'm going to be your faculty advisor. I'm going to help you do it. I'm going to help you get support. But I'll tell you, let's have a deal. I want to make sure two things. Number one, don't try to be smarter than the professors. We don't need more smart people at Harvard. We have more than enough. We need you to appeal to the heart, to the neshama, to the soul. We need you to give what students don't get at Harvard. And he said, great. And I said, the other thing's going to be a lot harder, and it became very controversial. Please try to sponsor events where men and women don't have to sit separately. And that's the way they started. All the events were events that were not religiously oriented, and they could sit together. Chabad became so popular at Harvard that, of course, the students demanded a minyan. And the Chabad minyan, of course, has to be separate. But let me tell you, it is as unseparate as any minyan can be. It has flowers in the middle. The mechitza is a flower. And as soon as it's over, the flower goes away. And they do everything in their power. And of course, as you know, Chabad never sits in judgment of people. When I used to go to the Chabad dinners, I was the faculty advisor. I would have Jared Kushner on one side. He was a first-year student. On the other side, I'd have a kid who had tattoos on his arms and just came with a motorcycle and has a ring through his nose and then a Star of David. And he was just as welcome as Jared Kushner. No questions asked. Nobody asked, how are you getting home from here? You have 2 hours in which you are in a Jewish environment. We'll give you a little schnapps, a little kugel. We'll have a Dvar Torah. We'll talk. We'll share. We'll kibitz. And Chabad, it's the proudest thing I've done at university. I helped start Chabad at Harvard. You know how many Chabads there now are at universities around the world, not only in the United States and Canada, but around the world. It's caught on like wildfire. And it has changed the nature of Jews in universities. And Chabad should be so proud of what it did. And Hershey Zarki should be so proud of having the chutzpah to bring Chabad to Harvard. It was easy after he brought it to Harvard. Then Yale copied it, the Eliezer Society, and NYU, and Columbia. That was easy. But the first one was not easy. And there was a lot of resistance by Hillel, a lot of resistance by Jewish students. Why do we need Chabad? Come on, that's so old-fashioned. We're modern, we're new-fashioned. We don't need beards and payas and shadels. We need modern rabbis who can talk about Spinoza. Of course, Chabad rabbis can talk about Spinoza too, but they do it from the neshama. So I'm a big fan. And I love Chabad, and it's amazing. I wish the Rebbe had lived to see what he and his inspiration had accomplished for American education. It's incomparable. And may you go from strength to strength, and may you continue doing what you're doing. You're doing such important work.
So on that note, I have the incoming box of the text messages is furiously filled. Unfortunately, the hour is up, and I apologize for all our listeners who we could not get to your questions. Can we take a rain check when this whole COVID thing is over? Will you come to Chabad of Westmount? And can we have a l'chaim together? Can we have a conference, and can we talk? And can we have a talk with you? It will be the greatest honor for us, and it'll be a great way to continue this conversation.
Well, not only that, I can do that, but also if you get questions that I didn't have a chance to answer, send me one email with all the questions, and I'll try my best. I can't promise to at least answer the ones that I think are the most relevant, because I've enjoyed this conversation enormously. You're both fantastic. And Montreal, Brooklyn Union, what could be better? Do you fight over who has better bagels?
No, hands down, we have better bagels.
I agree with you. The Montreal bagels, I have a Montreal bagel shirt. I have to tell you, the Montreal bagels are better, but I think that New York pastrami has it over smoked meats in Montreal. At least that's my view. Bagels, Montreal, pastrami, New York. But we can fight that out. When I come there again, you'll serve me some kosher smoked meat on a bagel, and we'll have a comparison.
That is fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor Dershowitz, for this honor and for this opportunity to discuss, to dialogue, to be informed. It was a fascinating discussion. It was a fun discussion. And we truly do look forward to having you come to Chabad of Westmount, perhaps for one of our law symposiums or for a community.
We'll do it. We'll do it. Just be safe, everybody. Be healthy, and happy Shavuos.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you so much. Thank
See
you.
ya.
Have a wonderful evening.
Right, you too. Thanks.